Something fundamental is shifting in the architecture of Western power. Not loudly, not with dramatic announcements, but unmistakably. Europe, Canada, Australia, and Japan are forming a new coalition. A coalition of democracies standing with Ukraine. A coalition coordinating military aid, economic support, and diplomatic strategy. Without America. In some cases, despite America. This is the biggest shift in Western alliances since World War II. And it's happening right now in real time as American policy diverges from its traditional partners in ways that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. The alliance America built, the one that defined global security for 8 decades, is quietly preparing for a future where American leadership can no longer be taken for granted. This is that story. Let's start with a moment that crystallizes the shift. Sunday at Mar-a-Lago, President Trump meets with Ukrainian President Zelensky. Before that meeting, Trump spends 2.5 hours on the phone with Vladimir Putin. The optics alone tell a story. The American president consults with the aggressor before meeting with the victim. He coordinates positions with Moscow before discussing them with Kyiv. European diplomats noticed. Canadian officials noticed. Australian and Japanese observers noticed. Because this isn't just unusual. This represents a fundamental inversion of how Western alliances traditionally operate. In the normal pattern, the United States would consult with allies first, coordinate positions, present a unified front, then engage with adversaries from that position of collective strength. But that's not what happened, and it's not the first time it hasn't happened. Now watch what happened the same week. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met with Zelensky in Ottawa. He announced $22.5 billion in economic assistance for Ukraine. He spoke about standing with Ukraine during this difficult time and called Russian attacks barbarism. The contrast couldn't be starker. Trump at Mar-a-Lago, coordinating with Putin, talking about how Russia wants to help Ukraine. Carney in Ottawa, committing billions, using clear moral language about Russian aggression. 2 meetings with Zelensky, 2 completely different messages about where their countries stand. But here's what makes this particularly significant. Carney wasn't acting alone. He referenced a meeting with colleagues from the Coalition of the Willing, a phrase that signals coordinated action among democracies supporting Ukraine. That phrase matters, because it echoes historical moments when nations banded together for collective security. But this time, the United States isn't leading that coalition. In some analyses, it's not even part of it. The Coalition of the Willing. Let's break down who's actually in it. Canada, obviously. Mark Carney has made Ukraine support a centerpiece of Canadian foreign policy. $22.5 billion in economic aid, military equipment, training programs, diplomatic coordination, the European Union collectively. Multiple mechanisms for providing aid, equipment, and reconstruction support. The EU has committed over $50 billion in various forms of assistance since the invasion began. The United Kingdom. Consistent military aid, including advanced weapons systems. Training programs for Ukrainian forces. Intelligence sharing, diplomatic leadership, Australia. Military equipment, training, financial support. Despite being geographically distant, maintaining steady commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty. Japan. Economic sanctions on Russia. Financial aid to Ukraine. Diplomatic support in international forums. A significant shift in Japanese foreign policy positioning. These aren't just symbolic gestures. These are substantial sustained commitments involving real resources, real military equipment, and real diplomatic capital. And they're being coordinated largely without American leadership. In some cases, despite American policy diverging from the collective position. To understand how extraordinary this is, you need historical context. Since 1945, the fundamental architecture of Western security has been American-led. NATO operates under American military leadership. Major security initiatives originate in Washington. Allied nations coordinate their positions with American policy. This wasn't just about American power. It was about reliable American commitment to collective defense, democratic values, and rules-based international order. When the Soviet Union collapsed, That architecture didn't disappear. It expanded. Former Warsaw Pact nations joined NATO precisely because American security guarantees seemed dependable. The assumption underlying everything, America would lead. America would be there. America could be counted on. That assumption is now being questioned by America's closest allies. Not because they want to, because they feel they have to. The questioning didn't start with Ukraine policy. It's been building for years. The 2018 NATO summit, where Trump publicly questioned the alliance's value and suggested he might not honor Article 5 commitments. European leaders left that summit shaken, quietly discussing contingency plans. The Afghanistan withdrawal in 2021, where America departed without meaningful consultation with allies who had troops on the ground. The message received: American decisions will be made unilaterally, and allies will be informed after the fact. Trade policy under both Trump administrations, where tariffs were imposed on allies, including Canada and European nations, with rhetoric treating them as economic adversaries rather than partners. And now Ukraine, where American policy appears more aligned with Russian preferences than with those of traditional allies supporting Ukrainian sovereignty. Each incident by itself might be manageable. Allies have disagreed before. But the pattern is what's driving the response. European officials are remarkably frank in private conversations, though careful in public statements. One senior European diplomat, speaking on background to multiple news outlets, put it this way: "We cannot plan our security on the assumption of American reliability. We must have alternatives." Another, from a NATO member state: "The alliance isn't dead, but we're preparing for scenarios where American policy diverges so far from European interests that we need independent capability." These aren't anti-American statements. These are pragmatic assessments from countries that desperately want the traditional alliance to function. But they're being forced to confront a reality where it might not. The planning is concrete. European defense ministers are discussing increased military integration, joint procurement, coordinated industrial capacity. These aren't just discussions. They're being implemented. Canada's position is particularly telling. Canada has been America's most integrated ally. Shared defense infrastructure, interlinked economies, cultural ties. A border that has been described as the longest undefended border in the world. For Canada to implement a $500 billion economic diversification strategy explicitly designed to reduce dependence on the American market, that's not normal policy adjustment. That's fundamental strategic reorientation. And Canadian officials have been direct about why. The unpredictability of American trade policy, combined with concerns about American commitment to collective defense, has made concentrated dependence feel like strategic vulnerability rather than partnership advantage. When your closest ally treats you as a negotiating opponent rather than a partner, you build alternatives. That's what Canada is doing. Systematically, permanently. The Australian and Japanese positioning is equally significant in different ways. Australia is geographically distant from Europe, but deeply concerned about rules-based international order. If territorial conquest through military force becomes acceptable in Ukraine, the precedent matters enormously for the Indo-Pacific. Australian officials have been clear. Supporting Ukraine isn't just about Europe. It's about maintaining the principle that borders can't be changed by force. That principle matters existentially for smaller democracies facing larger authoritarian neighbors. Japan has made perhaps the most dramatic shift. Historically constrained by post-WWII constitutional limitations on military engagement, Japan has provided substantial support to Ukraine and has begun discussing security arrangements that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The common thread: these nations are positioning themselves not just to support Ukraine, but to coordinate with each other in ways that don't rely on American leadership. Let's be specific about what this coalition is actually doing. Military support. The UK has provided advanced missiles, tanks, training programs. France and Germany have provided artillery, air defense systems, armored vehicles. Poland has been Ukraine's strongest European supporter with substantial equipment transfers. Economic support. The EU has committed over $50 billion through various mechanisms. Canada's $22.5 billion. Japan's financial packages, Australia's targeted assistance. Reconstruction planning. European institutions are coordinating plans for post-war Ukrainian reconstruction, involving the World Bank, IMF, and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Diplomatic coordination. Regular meetings among foreign ministers, defense ministers, and heads of state. Coordinating positions, planning next steps, maintaining unified messaging. This is an operational alliance, not just talk. Real resources, real coordination, real strategic planning. And while the United States is still providing some support to Ukraine, American policy is increasingly out of sync with this coalition's approach and objectives. The policy divergence is stark in specific areas. On ceasefire terms, the European-Canadian-Japanese coalition supports Ukrainian territorial integrity and opposes forced concessions. American policy, based on Trump's statements, seems more focused on ending the conflict quickly, even if that requires Ukrainian territorial concessions. On Russian responsibility, coalition members use clear language about Russian aggression and war crimes. American official statements have been notably more ambiguous, with Trump characterizing Russian intentions as helpful. On security guarantees, European nations are discussing concrete commitments to Ukrainian security. American commitments remain unclear and contingent. On sanctions, European sanctions on Russia remain in place and have been strengthened. American policy on sanctions has been more variable. These aren't minor differences. They represent fundamentally different understandings of the conflict and its implications. The historical parallel that keeps coming up in strategic discussions, the 1930s. Not because anyone thinks we're heading for World War, but because of the pattern of democratic nations trying to maintain collective security while one major power pursues a different approach. In the 1930s, Britain and France tried to maintain European security while America pursued isolation. The result was a security architecture that proved inadequate when tested. Now the dynamic is inverted. European democracies, along with Canada, Australia, and Japan, are trying to maintain collective security while America pursues what some call accommodation with authoritarian aggression. The lesson from the 1930s that worries strategists: when democracies can't coordinate, authoritarians exploit the divisions. Let's talk about what this means for NATO. NATO isn't dead. The alliance still exists. Article 5 commitments are still on paper. But the psychological foundation is shifting. NATO was built on the assumption that an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all, and that American military power would be the primary response mechanism. But if European nations increasingly doubt American will to actually implement Article 5, if they worry that an American president might decide treaty commitments aren't worth honoring, then they need backup plans. Those backup plans are being developed. European defense integration isn't happening because Europeans want distance from America. It's happening because they're no longer confident they can rely solely on American protection. French President Macron has been most vocal, talking about European strategic autonomy. But he's not alone. German defense officials are discussing increased military capability. Polish military spending is surging. This isn't anti-NATO. This is hedge your bets NATO, where European members maintain the alliance but build independent capability in case American commitments prove unreliable. The economic dimension matters too. The coalition of democracies supporting Ukraine isn't just coordinating military aid. They're building economic relationships that reduce dependence on American markets and American financial systems. Canada's trade diversification strategy with ASEAN nations. European emphasis on economic integration with non-American partners. Japanese and Australian trade agreements that don't include the United States. This is long-term strategic positioning, not just about Ukraine, about building an architecture of economic relationships that can function without American participation if necessary. The assumption driving this: if American trade policy treats allies as adversaries, if tariffs can be imposed without warning, if trade agreements can be discarded based on political preference, then concentrated dependence on American markets is strategic vulnerability. Build alternatives, diversify, create options. That's the economic strategy paralleling the security strategy. and it's being implemented systematically across multiple democracies simultaneously, American officials seem largely unaware of how significant this shift is. Public statements from Washington continue to assume American centrality, that when America speaks, allies will follow, that American preferences define coalition positions. But that's increasingly not how it works. When European leaders visit Kyiv, they don't check with Washington first. When Canada announces aid packages, it's not coordinated through American channels. When Australia makes defense commitments, they're decided in Canberra, not cleared through Washington. This represents a fundamental shift in how decisions are made. From American-led to coordinated among allies, with American participation when American policy aligns with the broader coalition. That's a very different architecture from the one that has defined Western security for 8 decades. The Ukrainian perspective on this is particularly interesting. Ukrainian officials maintain diplomatic relations with Washington because they have no choice. American military aid, when it flows, is substantial. American diplomatic support, when it's offered, matters in international forums. But Ukrainian strategic planning increasingly centers on the European coalition. Canadian commitments, UK weapons systems, French diplomatic engagement, Polish logistical support. These relationships feel more reliable to Ukrainian officials because the commitment seems less contingent on individual leadership changes. European support for Ukraine has remained steady across different governments, different political coalitions, different electoral outcomes. American support has been variable, depending on who's president, what their personal views on Russia are, how they assess political considerations. From Ukraine's perspective, the coalition of the willing provides strategic stability that American policy currently doesn't. Let's address what this doesn't mean. This doesn't mean NATO is ending. The alliance still exists and still has value. This doesn't mean America is completely excluded. American participation in collective security is still welcome when American policy aligns. This doesn't mean allies have given up on the traditional transatlantic partnership. They would prefer that partnership to function reliably. But it does mean allies are preparing for scenarios where American policy diverges too far from allied interests to maintain the traditional assumption of American leadership. It means building capability, resources, and coordination mechanisms that can function without American participation. It means accepting that the alliance architecture that defined the post-1945 world may be transitioning into something different. The longer-term implications are profound. If this pattern continues, if American policy remains out of sync with traditional allies on major security questions, the divergence becomes structural rather than temporary. Infrastructure built for European defense integration doesn't disappear when political winds shift in Washington. Trade relationships established with non-American partners don't vanish if American policy changes. Economic supply chains designed to reduce American dependence become permanent features of how economies function. Defense procurement coordinated among European nations creates industries and capabilities that persist regardless of future American positioning. In other words, the strategic hedging becomes the new reality. The backup plans become the primary plans. And American influence in shaping how democracies respond to global challenges diminishes accordingly. There's a question of American domestic politics here. Does the American public understand what's happening? Do they grasp that the alliance America built is preparing for scenarios where American leadership can't be counted on? Most Americans probably don't focus on these dynamics. Foreign policy isn't usually central to domestic political debate. And when it is discussed, it's often in terms of burden sharing and whether allies are doing enough, not whether American reliability is questioned. But the consequences will matter. American global influence has rested substantially on being the leader of a coalition of democracies. When that coalition increasingly coordinates without American leadership, American influence diminishes. Economic costs matter too. Allies who build alternative trade relationships represent lost market opportunities. Defense cooperation that happens without American industry means lost business for American companies. These aren't immediate crises, but they're strategic erosion that compounds over time. Watch what happens next. The coalition of the willing will continue coordinating on Ukraine. They'll hold meetings, coordinate aid packages, plan for long-term Ukrainian security. European defense integration will continue. Procurement coordination, joint training, capability development, economic diversification away from concentrated American dependence will continue. New trade agreements, supply chain restructuring, financial system alternatives. All of this will happen gradually, not with dramatic announcements, not with anyone declaring the end of transatlantic partnership, but the cumulative effect is unmistakable. A slow, steady shift in the architecture of how democracies coordinate on global security, from American-led to jointly coordinated, from assumption of American reliability to backup plans when American policy diverges. The alliance isn't breaking in the sense of ending, but it's breaking in the sense of fragmenting, shifting, transforming into something that looks different from what's existed since 1945. The question that matters most, can this be reversed? Could a future American administration rebuild the trust, reliability, and centrality that's eroding? Possibly. But it would require more than just different policy positions. It would require rebuilding the foundational assumption of American reliability, demonstrating that American commitments can be counted on, that treaties mean something, that allies are partners rather than negotiating opponents. That's harder to rebuild than it is to damage. Trust accumulates slowly and erodes quickly. And even if American policy shifted tomorrow, the infrastructure being built, European defense integration, Canadian economic diversification, coalition coordination mechanisms, wouldn't disappear. It would remain as insurance against future unpredictability. Here's what makes this moment historically significant. The alliance of democracies that won World War II, that contained Soviet expansion during the Cold War, that defined global security for most of a century, that alliance is fundamentally restructuring, not ending, but transforming into something where American leadership can no longer be assumed, where other democracies must be capable of coordinating without American participation when American policy diverges too far from collective interests. The coalition of the willing standing with Ukraine represents that transformation in action. Nations that would traditionally coordinate through Washington are coordinating with each other, making decisions jointly, committing resources collectively, without American leadership, in some cases, despite American policy pointing in a different direction. This is the biggest shift in Western alliance structure since NATO's founding. And it's happening right now, driven by the reality that American policy has become too unpredictable for allies to base their security solely on American commitments. The West without America as its unquestioned leader. That's the future being built. One aid package, one defense procurement decision, one trade agreement at a time. The alliance is breaking, not ending, but breaking into something different. Something that might be more resilient in some ways, less dependent on any single nation's political winds, but also something that reflects a profound loss of American influence and centrality in shaping how democracies respond to global challenges. That's the shift underway, and Ukraine policy is where it's becoming impossible to ignore.